9 Most famous unsolved mysteries that solved by DNA profiling. DNA profiling is most commonly used as a forensic technique in criminal investigations to identify an unidentified person or whose identity needs to be confirmed, or to place a person at a crime scene or to eliminate a person from consideration. There was no better tool for solving mysteries and inquiring cold case than DNA profiling. Number 9. The missing Titanic survivor. DNA solved a 70-year-old question of whether Lorraine Allison survived the Titanic crash. Many have wondered what happened to the 2-year-old little girl who disappeared from the crash more than 100 years ago. The story begins with Hudson and Bess taking their 2 kids, Trevor, 7 months, and Lorraine, 2 years of age, across the Atlantic on the Titanic. At the time of the sinking, it is said that Trevor was rushed to a lifeboat by their mate and that the other 3 died on the boat. However, only Hudson's body was found, leaving the mystery of what happened to Lorraine and her mother. The unknown remained until 28 years later when Helen Kramer came forward on a radio show called We the People, and said that she was the 2-year-old missing girl. Only a few of the distant relatives believed her story, but immediate family members denied the claims and kept her out of the inheritance. When Helen died in 1992, the claims seemed to have died with her. However, in 2012 the granddaughter of Helen, Deborah Woods, resurfaced the claims by saying she had inherited more evidence from her grandmother and that the truth should be told. With all of this evidence, and with a desire to solve this case, a group of Titanic researchers put together a project to help unlock the mystery. They did just that, by convincing descendants from each family to have a DNA test done. The results from the tests show that there is not a relationship between the 2 families, suggesting that this was a hoax or a complete misunderstanding. We don't want to downplay the tragedy of this story to those involved but rather highlight that we have a tool that will help us unlock the mysteries of our past with DNA testing. Number 8. Case of James Hanratty. DNA tests are being carried out to determine whether a man was wrongly hanged for the 1961 murder of an Abbots Langley scientist. It is possible scientists may have to exhume the body of James Hanratty, which is buried at Carpenter's Park Lawn Cemetery, to solve the 37-year-old mystery. Hanratty was executed in 1962 for the murder of Michael Gregston, of Shirley Road, Abbots Langley, and the rape and shooting of Valerie Story, from near Slough, in a lay-by off Dead Man's Hill on the A6. Hanratty, who was 25, was buried at Bedford Prison and moved to Carpenter's Park in 1966. Campaigners have continued to battle to prove his innocence, and a new inquiry into one of Britain's most notorious criminal cases is being carried out by the government's Criminal Cases Review Commission. A spokesman from the commission could not confirm or deny whether Hanratty's body would need to be exhumed from its resting place at the Brent Council-owned cemetery in Oxley Lane. Mr. Bob Langford, director of the cemetery, said, "The fact that James Hanratty is buried here does create quite a lot of interest. Every time there is something new in the case there are a few people who come and see the grave. We recently had someone visit from Sheffield. I think until it is proved one way or the other whether he was guilty, it will always be in people's minds." The spokesman for the commission said they will be closer to solving the mystery in the next 3 months following exhaustive scientific tests, which include DNA tests. It is believed DNA samples found on Miss Story's underwear have already been compared with samples taken from Hanratty's relatives. It is also reported that samples have recently been taken from Ms. Story, who was crippled for life after the shooting, but exhuming Hanratty's body would provide vital evidence. Family and supporters of Hanratty have staged a 36-year-long campaign for a posthumous pardon, making it one of the most enduring and controversial cases in Britain. Finally, in 2002, Hanratty's body was exhumed, so that DNA testing could be performed on evidentiary material, including semen samples found in Story's underwear and a handkerchief. Hanratty's DNA turned out a perfect match, providing conclusive evidence that he was guilty all along. Number 7. The conviction of Roger Keith Coleman. If there was an American equivalent of James Hanratty, it would probably be Roger Keith Coleman, who initially seemed like a poster child for the unjust execution of innocent people. On March 10, 1981, 19-year-old Wanda McCoy was murdered inside her home in Grundy, Virginia. She was raped, stabbed to death, and nearly beheaded. The prime suspect was McCoy's brother-in-law, Roger Keith Coleman, who had a previous conviction for attempted rape. Coleman's pants had small spots of blood on them, and 2 male pubic hairs found on McCoy's body were consistent with Coleman's. Coleman would eventually be convicted of rape and murder and sentenced to death. However, the evidence against Coleman was very circumstantial, and numerous witnesses placed Coleman at other locations during the time period the crime took place. While on death row, Coleman spent the next several years appealing his sentence, and his case garnered enough publicity that he gained a slew of supporters, including Pope John Paul II, who believed in his innocence and petitioned for clemency. Nevertheless, Coleman was put to death in the electric chair on May 20, 1992. Before his execution, Coleman stated, "An innocent man is going to be murdered tonight," and expressed hope that his death would play a role in bringing an end to the death penalty. Coleman's supporters and anti-death penalty activists never stopped fighting to clear his name. Finally, in 2006, they successfully lobbied for DNA evidence from the crime scene to be tested. To their shock, the DNA test officially confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt that Roger Keith Coleman was the perpetrator. Number 6. The reunion of the Hagans household. On June 11, 1968, 3-year-old Jonathan Hagans disappeared during a family gathering at Jacksonville Beach in Florida. Police assumed that Jonathan walked into the ocean and drowned, but his family wasn't sure. Shortly before Jonathan went missing, witnesses had seen him following his father toward a snack bar. His family became convinced that 2 unidentified men and a woman standing near the establishment had abducted Jonathan. The case remained cold until 1989, when authorities were contacted by a 24-year-old Buffalo man named David Bonnable, who had recently seen an age-progressed photo of Jonathan Hagans. Bonnable told the Haganses that he believed he was their long-lost son. According to Bonnable, he had been raised in the swamps of Louisiana by a Romanian woman named Rita. Bonnable claimed that Rita imprisoned and sexually abused him throughout his childhood before he managed to run away during his teen years. He had no idea he had been abducted from his real family until he heard Jonathan's story. The Hagans family believed Bonnable's story at first, but suffered a major heartbreak when DNA testing was performed on him. It confirmed with 100% certainty that David Bonnable was not Jonathan Hagans. In fact, Bonnable was nothing more than a ruthless con man. Bonnable had spent the previous few years peddling a fabricated story to various TV shows about being an abducted child searching for his parents. It turned out Bonnable was actually a Mexican citizen living illegally in the United States and was hoping to be adopted by an American family to gain U.S. citizenship. Sadly, no trace of the real Jonathan Hagans has ever been found. Number 5. The adoption of Heather Robinson. For years, a Chicago couple named Don and Helen Robinson had hassled conceiving a child or adopting one through traditional channels. Nevertheless, in January 1985, they have been contacted by Don's brother, John Edward Robinson, and have been shocked to be told that he had a toddler lady with him. In keeping with John, the kid's mom had just lately dedicated suicide in a home violence shelter. If Don and Helen would pay John a pair thousand for authorized charges, he might act as a liaison and prepare for them to legally undertake the kid. The Robinsons agreed to the association, and John quickly introduced them with adoption papers to Signal. The kid now formally belonged to Don and Helen, who would elevate her underneath the title Heather Robinson. Sadly, the couple didn't know that John Edward Robinson made no authorized preparations for them in any respect and had solid the adoption papers. Even worse, he was a serial killer and had possibly murdered the kid's actual mom. Robinson had a historical past of legal conduct, together with embezzlement and sexual assault. However, issues took a lot darker flip when the bodies of 5 ladies have been discovered inside barrels on each his property and a close-by storage locker. Robinson was given the dying penalty for 3 counts of homicide, however he's believed to be answerable for many extra deaths. In January 1985, a girl named Lisa Stassi mysteriously disappeared alongside her 4-month-old daughter, Tiffany. On the time, she had just lately turned out to be acquainted with Robinson. In 2000, DNA testing would affirm that the lady raised as Heather Robinson was Tiffany Stassi. Though Lisa Stassi is presumed lifeless, her physique has by no means been discovered. Number 4. The fate of Dr. Josef Mengele. After the end of World War II, Dr. Josef Mengele was one of the most wanted Nazi war criminals in the world. Known as the Angel of Death, Mengele was the notorious physician at Auschwitz concentration camp who performed horrific experiments on Jewish prisoners for the purposes of genetic research. After Auschwitz was liberated, Mengele was held in custody at 2 American prisoner of war camps, but they inexplicably released him. Mengele eventually managed to flee to South America, where he would spend the next 3 decades on the run. By the 80s, rumors began circulating that Mengele was dead, but there were still unconfirmed sightings of him throughout the world, and $3.5 million in reward money was offered for his capture. In February 1985, a mock trial was held for Mengele in Jerusalem where 106 of his survivors testified about his atrocities. 2 months later, West German police would raid the home of one of Mengele's friends and find a letter from a couple named Wolfram and Lieslot Bossert which mentioned the death of a mutual friend. The Bosserts were soon located in Brazil and interrogated. They finally led authorities to a cemetery in Embu containing the grave of a man named Wolfgang Gerard. According to the Bosserts, Gerard was actually Josef Mengele. He had drowned after suffering a stroke while swimming on February 7, 1979. Even so, there was still some skepticism that the remains belonged to Mengele. In 1992, the long manhunt was finally brought to a definitive end when DNA testing was performed on Gerard's remains, confirming that the dead man was Josef Mengele. Number 3. The fake teenager. In 1997, Brianna Stewart, a 16-year-old high school student from Vancouver, Washington, accused 47-year-old security guard Charles Blankenship of raping her. Blankenship would be charged with having sex with a minor and sentenced to 1 year in jail. This seemed to be the latest in a long line of sexual assaults suffered by the enigmatic Brianna Stewart. She spent her teen years living in foster homes, garnering a lot of sympathy with her tales of past abuse. Brianna claimed she ran away from home at age 12 to escape an abusive Satanist father who had murdered her mother. In 2001, Brianna was hoping to attend college, but would need to obtain a birth certificate and social security number. During a fingerprint check, a surprising discovery was made. This high schooler was actually a 31-year-old woman named Treva Throneberry. Treva Throneberry was born in Wichita Falls, Texas in 1969. Even though she was sexually abused by an uncle during her childhood, her tendency to fabricate stories started at age 16 when she falsely accused her father of raping her at gunpoint. After she reached adulthood, Treva spent most of the 1990s traveling the country and passing herself off as a teenager under different aliases. She usually lived in homeless shelters and foster homes and chronicled many outrageous stories of abuse, which often involved Satanism. After the fingerprint check uncovered Treva's real identity, she was arrested and charged with theft, fraud, and perjury. Even though she continued to maintain that her real name was Brianna Stewart, DNA testing conclusively determined that she was Treva Throneberry. The false conviction of Charles Blankenship was promptly expunged from his record and Treva was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Number 2. The identification of Scott Morris. The invention of DNA profiling has often been a godsend for resolving missing persons cases. Sometimes, a dead body will be found and remain unidentified for years until DNA testing matches the deceased victim to a missing person. Even though DNA profiling can provide closure for a victim's family, there are also rare occasions when it takes closure away. On August 14, 1978, 14-year-old Scott Morris mysteriously disappeared after leaving his Indianapolis home to walk to a nearby market. At the time, Scott was known for being a runaway, so police did not take his disappearance seriously. Scott's family never saw him again, but a family friend received a strange call in 1989 from a man claiming to be Scott, who confirmed he was still alive and working at a carnival. Years later, Scott's family received surprising news about a seemingly unrelated cold case. On January 7, 1990, a nude unidentified young man was found beaten and shot to death in Daviess County, Kentucky. Since the victim's hands and feet had been cut off and all his teeth were removed, identification was difficult. However, in 2007, a search of the missing persons database led authorities to Scott Morris, who bore a striking resemblance to the victim. The body was tentatively identified as Scott. He was returned to the Morris family and given a proper burial. Unfortunately, it turned out the identification had been premature. In 2009, the final portions of the DNA identification process were completed and authorities were horrified to learn they had made a mistake. The unidentified victim was not Scott Morris. Sadly, two separate cold cases have now reverted back to their unsolved status. Number 1. The heart of Dauphin Louis XVII of France. One of the great mysteries of European history was resolved after DNA tests revealed that the son of executed French King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette died as a child in prison. Royalists have argued for 205 years over whether Louis Charles de France perished in a grim Paris prison or managed to escape the clutches of the French Revolution. Last December, the presumed heart of the child king was removed from its resting place to enable scientists to compare its DNA makeup with samples from living and dead members of his family, including a lock of Marie Antoinette's hair. "It is the heart of Louis XVII," said historian Philippe Delorme, announcing the results of the analysis. "This is a great day for an historian. It is very exciting to put an end to one of the greatest enigmas of French history. To draw close to a mystery that has given rise to more than 800 books," he told Reuters. 8-year-old Louis Charles de France automatically became King Louis XVII when Louis XVI was guillotined before huge crowds in central Paris at the height of the revolution in 1793. At the time, the boy was held in the forbidding temple prison to prevent any monarchist bid to free him, and was forcibly separated from his mother. At her subsequent trial, a signed statement from the boy was produced claiming that she had forced him to commit incest. Marie Antoinette was executed shortly afterwards. Louis Charles was treated like a caged animal and was reported dead in 1795 from what is today recognized to have been tuberculosis. An autopsy was carried out on the boy's body at the prison and his heart was removed by the chief doctor. Reports, however, quickly spread that the body was not that of Louis XVII and that he had been spirited away alive by sympathizers with another child's body left in his place. Would-be royal heirs popped up across Europe and some of their descendants still have small retinues of followers today. Wednesday's news was welcomed by the Bourbon family, which lays claim to the defunct French throne via blood ties dating back to Louis XIV. "Science has come to the rescue of history," said Louis de Bourbon, Duke of Anjou. "The memory of this young prince, who died aged 10 after terrible suffering, should be a symbol for us of martyred childhood," the Duke told reporters. The boy's heart changed hands many times and was finally placed in 1975 at the royal crypt in the Cathedral of Saint Denis outside Paris, burial place of French kings. It was ceremonially removed on December 14 by a handful of aristocrats. One fragment was tested by Professor Jean Casseman of Louvain University in Belgium and another piece by Professor Ernst Brinkmann of Münster University in Germany in 2000. Scientists from the two laboratories said the DNA fragments were not perfect, but they could determine enough of a pattern to be sure that Marie Antoinette was the child's mother. The heart was finally given a proper burial at the royal crypt. If you enjoy video, please subscribe my channel. Thanks for watching.